because this is true actually in pretty much every part of life. You have some kind of emergent effect from, you know, the way whole. Yeah, exactly. Take for instance, like human interaction. Like none of that's planned. We all act as like an individual agent, but then you get like big macroscopic effects and patterns that seem to emerge from nowhere, despite like no one coordinating it.
What is up, Max? Good to see you, man.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's really great to meet you.
Having a good day?
I am a little bit hectic. I just arrived. I'm in a hotel right now, so hopefully the Wi-Fi is good and nothing is spotty.
It seems okay to me. Oh,
all right.
Whereabouts are you?
Rotterdam. I don't know if you know where that is. It's in Holland.
Yeah. Where the port is.
Exactly.
Port of Rotterdam. Yeah. I know.
That's it.
So are you Dutch or?
I am. Yes, I'm Dutch.
Oh, cool.
Born here. Yeah.
Nice.
What about yourself? What about yourself?
I'm from London, but I'm half German. So most people in England think I'm German. So.
Do you speak German as well?
Yeah. Although I mean, I do consider English my first language. So I've lived in London pretty much my whole life, to be honest.
Nice. What's it like to live in London? Hectic, busy, expensive, probably.
Yeah, it's expensive.
But you got that sweet PhD.
The thing is that I was born here and I grew up here, so I don't really know it any different. And then I moved to Oxford a couple of years ago, and I've recently moved back. And yeah, my flat is so much more expensive than in Oxford, and it's not as, you know, nice and green as in Oxford. So I don't know. I think I'm a little bit fed up with the busyness, I guess. But we'll see. I still love London. There's lots. It's a big city, you know.
Yeah. Interesting. It's been a while since I've been there. I went just right before COVID hit.
Yeah.
So yeah, right before COVID. So it's been a while during the whole lockdown and the pandemic. Didn't travel as much. Looking forward to going again.
To be honest, I think it's pretty much exactly the same place as it was, you know, 24 months ago. I couldn't tell it's really changed. But it's one of those weird places where there's, you know, there's whole areas which are completely different to, you know, the other end of London. You wouldn't know it's the same city if
Do you went to Oxford for your studies?
No. So my partner was working in a hospital in Oxford. I was working from home. She wasn't. So it's easier to live there than it is to live where I need to work. And
makes perfect sense.
No, so I did my PhD at Imperial in London, and I started a postdoc recently. So I'm no longer at Imperial.
Exciting.
I'm now a postdoc at City.
I see. Yeah, that's actually part of the reason why I wanted to have a chat, because I found you on Twitter somehow. Can't remember exactly how, but yeah, it seemed super interesting. So I was curious. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about you know, what it is that you do, and especially like how you ended up doing what you're doing right now, like the way into mathematics, etc.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I guess so. Huh?
When you were 5.
Yeah. No. We're not starting that far back. I need to decide, you know, what age should we start with? No, so I did physics undergrad. So my bachelor's and my master's was in physics, and I kind of did that because, you know, I had that attitude that you can pretty much do whatever you want after doing a physics degree. I didn't really have any plan on staying in academia. And actually, like in my third year undergrad, I really had no intention on doing a PhD. But then I did the two courses. One was on statistical mechanics in physics, and the other was on complex systems. And one of the things that's nice studying complex systems is that it has a lot to do with emergence. So my attitude has always been that, you know, physics is really good at understanding problems at like one very specific length scale. They're really good at very small things, and they're really good at really big things like, you know, stars, planets, all that.
Yes.
But they're
But
really
like the stuff in
bad
between.
at the
Yeah.
in between, and they're also bad
Yeah.
at, you know, explaining how you go from like sort of microscopic interactions to something that has, you know, some macroscopic emergent property. Anyway,
Yes. So how classical mechanics emerges from quantum mechanics, for example, like why when you
well,
have,
I mean, so that, I guess that's, you'd say that is the cliche, you know, example of it. Yeah, yeah. But I, you know, that's one of the grand problems of, you know, all of physics science. I mean it in a sense completely more generally than that, because this is true actually in pretty much every part of life. You have some kind of emergent effect from, you know, the way how, yeah, exactly. Take for instance like human interaction, like none of that's planned. We all act as like an individual agent, but then you get like big macroscopic effects and patterns that seem to emerge from nowhere despite like no one coordinating it. And those kind of emergent properties, that's kind of the theme in complexity science. Anyway, so that gripped me, and then I did this project with one of the professors at Imperial, and it kind of just snowballed from there. So I ended up doing a PhD in complexity science. And so many years later, now I'm doing a postdoc in complexity science and network science and, you know, computational social science. It's very hard to say exactly which box I fit in these days.
Dude, that's so cool, man.
Yeah, it's nice. So there's a lot to it. Yeah.
That's interesting. When you I got a few friends who are, you know, in this whole space for entrepreneurship, etc.
Yeah.
Who talk a lot about complexity, but I never explored that area, so I have no idea whether or not like that's the same kind of complexity as the stuff that you're talking about, because I feel I suspect that what you are talking about is like very mathematical, and what they are talking about is more how should I put this, like pragmatic or empirical. I'm not exactly sure, or maybe, you know, like because I've heard some terms here and there, like complex adaptive systems, etc. And
yeah,
you know,
yeah, exactly.
The description of how systems work, function, kind of like, you know, this like a bush within a bush, and then you pull on something and you don't know how it'll affect all the other variables, you know, inside of that environment.
It's interesting actually. You know, one way I sometimes describe complexity on complexity science is that it's, you know, maths and physics approaches used to any problem you can think of that doesn't come under maths or physics.
I see.
I mean, lots of people would disagree with me saying that, but, you know, that's kind of, you know, it's when you're trying to take, you know, an analytical view of a problem in whatever field it might be, and you're approaching it with this set of common techniques, that's what you get a lot in complexity. And I think what you're saying, like, you know, these people, you know, working in entrepreneurship, who, you know, the complexity buzzword, I do think that comes from a, you know, a solid place. I guess people would say, you know, it's a way of saying like non-linear thinking, and that's very popular. You know, if you're in business, you don't want to have a linear mindset. You want to
yes, exactly. Yeah, what you're talking
and that
about
is the buzzword version of of I guess the mathematical concept that, you know, things are not necessarily predictable. You get sudden events and sudden changes in state, and if you appreciate how those sudden changes of state happen and how they come about, then you'll be better prepared for how, for instance, a business will change, or you know, a market will change. And I think that's where it comes from. And there are definitely some you know, public intellectuals who kind of channel that from the scientific side into the like wider public. Someone like Taleb, for instance, and his black swan stuff. Those ideas are, you know, none of that is surprising to a physicist, but they might be surprising. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. None of that's surprising if you come from a complexity background or a physics background, but they're ideas that don't fit well with, you know, people who don't have this pretty rigorous mathematical background.
Yeah. Then you start coming more into my domain, where you start making a separation between first finding out what's true and what's baloney. That's obviously the first important step. But then a second important component, which is often forgotten or neglected, is okay. Now that we have figured out what's actually true, how can we make sure that people actually, you know, use this particular knowledge and such that you get the dissemination of information and that it actually impacts behavior. And sometimes I see it in marketing as well, you know, marketing science, there's a ton of stuff that we have figured out, but then you leave it too wordy, too scientific. You fail to make that nice connection, the translation between a scientific concept and you translate it in such a way that's actually like usable for the average person. And now you start thinking about like behavior design and all of these different things, because sometimes there's this unconscious assumption that merely the acquisition of information is sufficient. It's just about figuring out what's actually true and okay, we're done. But there's actually there's almost like an extra layer of art to it in order to figure out like how can we actually get people to use this, understand this, get comfortable with this. And for certain people, especially if you have a sufficiently advanced scientific background, actually digging into the literature is possible, provided there's sufficient amount of time. But sometimes that's not the case. You know, maybe it's overkill for someone. Maybe that person doesn't have the necessary background. And I think in those circumstances, the things that the example that you gave, Professor Taleb, has done, I think that's good, because it allows people to use these ideas. So the anti-fragile concept, this notion that, you know, certain systems can benefit from disorder versus, you know, robustness and fragility, and making it digestible. There's this channel, 3 Blue 1 Brown. He makes mathematics videos.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, that's a similar example. I read a paper a really long time ago when I was studying abstract algebra, and I was curious why all the education on abstract algebra was, you know, pretty awful. And it turns out there are a few papers written about exactly that. And one of the issues is precisely the thing that I just mentioned, where you have a professor, they learn something and they fail to realize that it's not sufficient to learn it and then, you know, present the information. And the end, there's almost like a separate skill. So you have the skill of learning and discovering what's true, but you also have the skill of how can I best transmit this knowledge into the heads of the students. And there's that resembles like cooking. You have to make a dish and then people eat it and then they give you feedback like it's too salty, it's too sweet. And it's similar when you're talking about like how can I best convey these ideas. And when it comes to the 3 Blue 1 Brown videos, that is a part where, you know, he's very good, because none of the mathematics that he is, you know, sharing is like, you know, groundbreaking or new, whatever.
I'm not sure I'd say that. I think some of it is, you know, pretty cutting edge.
Oh, okay. I meant more like, you know, he's not proving like the Poincare conjecture or whatever, and it's like, you know.
Yeah, but I mean, if that's
you know what I mean?
The benchmark we need to set, bloody hell.
yeah. Fair enough. But you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know.
He's in the business of educating. Like the second step, stuff has been figured out, and now the second problem: how can we best illustrate it in such a way that's easy to understand for people who are watching this?
But I think it's generally true that people don't make enough use of those people who have a talent for that kind of communication. I agree. Mean, yeah. I call myself a physicist.
I would just challenge the word like talent, because I believe it's a skill just as much as, you know, learning it in the first place. Yeah.
I mean, I would, I would never call myself a mathematician, partially because I just, the whole framework, which is like the cliche in maths, is just a way I don't find comfortable working with. And part of that is, it's got a very sort of old-fashioned lemma proof style structure. And I personally hate having to prove anything. So it's funny. It's funny.
That's the
you
coolest
talk
thing.
about like trying to work out like a truth and a communication and how like you convey a message accurately. I think this is, people kind of mention this as one of those problems, but I think they underestimate like quite how difficult it is. I mean,
that's a great point.
My attitude, I guess, is that it's pretty rare that it's a good idea to talk about what's true and not true. There are some, there are some cases where it might make sense, but generally,
pure
the vast
mathematics.
majority of the vast majority of truth is based on social norms and social convention.
Excellent point.
And it's funny. So the postdoc I started recently, I'm working in a group with a professor whose background is in social norms, understanding how social norms naturally come about.
Psychology, perchance?
No, he's a complexity scientist. He's a network scientist. But what he's interested in is he's interested in the literal question. So you have some network structure, yeah, and each point on that network is an individual, and then they're going to communicate with the other individuals in that network according to some structure. It's not that every person speaks to everyone else. It's that every person speaks to specific other people. And there might be directionality. So I might be able to say something to you, but you can't say anything back to me. And then you can play something like the naming game. There's this famous old naming game, which I would tell you the rules of now if I could remember it. But I think loosely speaking, it's about how names emerge. And what you see is that based on the structure of these networks, you see spontaneous emergence of a common set of names, for instance, and people.
I see.
So that's like giving a mathematical foundation for this concept of social norms. And so that's his background. And then we're working with some people in Italy, and their background is to do with misinformation and the formation of echo chambers, polarization, those kind of things. And what we're working on at the moment is let's call it information dynamics related to climate change. And the reason I call it information dynamics is the sort of the way, if I was writing for a media outlet, I wouldn't call it information dynamics. I'd say I'm working on misinformation related to climate change. But the problem precisely is that it's not as simple. No good comes from simply saying, this is true and this is false. Yeah, of course I have my opinions about climate change. The strongest of which is whether it's true or not, it seems stupid not to act on something which could potentially have major risks. I do think it's true, but I think even on a precautionary basis, it would be stupid not to act. But that's a side point. The interesting thing is, if you're trying to discuss the concept of misinformation, for instance, on climate change, it makes far more sense to approach the problem without the ideological bias of saying pro-climate news is true and climate denial news is false, because if you approach the problem like that in the first place, you're ignoring the complexity of the structure and how information flows through these network of human interactions. And there are interesting phenomena where, you know, if you think about the structure again, I might say something to you, you say something to your friend Ted, Ted says something to his friend Mary, she says something to me, but I don't know that she heard this through a chain that came from you. So you get these like self-reinforcing cycles. And for me, that's a far more interesting problem. The question is, how do you get this polarizing behavior based on the structure of how people interact? That's in a way a more interesting problem. And if we can understand that, then maybe we can start talking about the truth and how to communicate, you know, academic research in a way that is like accessible to the public. But if we don't understand, you know, the fundamental structure of interaction, then how are we going to have any chance, you know, controlling the message? Well, I don't want to say controlling the message is a bad way of putting it, but
nudge it in a certain direction.
Yeah, well, I guess the better way to put it is, how are we going to know how the message is going to, you know, actually impact people? Because the message will change and will morph, and it might actually not have the effect you expect it to have if you don't understand the structure.
That's quite interesting. Obviously, well, not obviously, because you might not know this, but I spend a lot of my time, all of my time essentially, working on entrepreneurial science, and like all of the subfields that are related. So it's very broad. It's more like a GP than, you know, a neurosurgeon or whatever. So you deal with consumer psychology, branding, marketing science, advertising, all of these different things, which you know, impact businesses and entrepreneurship in general. But as I'm hearing you talk, one of the things that I immediately start thinking about is like how relevant are things like cultural psychology, how relevant are things like consumer psychology, advertising. For example, advertising deals a lot with the link, the causality between creating an advert and impacting human behavior through the lens of selling a particular product. So is there are you guys, you know, looking at that, or you know, or is it like a totally different angle to tackle a similar problem, or how do you view that?
It's a good question. So I guess the easiest thing to say is, you know, I'm not sure I've ever spoken to anyone before working in entrepreneurial science. We're so removed from that end that, to be honest, I'm not sure I or anyone I've worked with could honestly say they've had any experience in these problems and in these fields. I guess, you know, when we're talking about things like climate misinformation, there are people on our project who have a background in social psychology.
Interesting. Yes.
But what is quite common, it's true in our project so far, and it's true in many cross-disciplinary projects where the people on the project are really so far apart, like a physicist, mathematician, and a psychologist, that despite us being on the same project, the interaction just isn't there. And the ability to combine our expertise has, you know, we've not worked out how best to do it. We're kind of running in parallel rather than running as one. So yeah, when you talk about things like an advertising, this, like, you know, psychology of how an advert is going to impact the consumer, that's super interesting, but it is so removed from what we talk about. The idea of, you know, the psychological impact is something so foreign to your typical mathematical complexity scientist that, you know, I think it would take a long time to, you know, better merge those fields in a way.
Is there something going on where an analogy would be the comparison between a pure mathematician who's working on, who's starting from a place of conjecture and working his way to a theorem, versus like an engineer who's, using laws of physics and using, applied mathematics to build a bridge, for example. So is that an analogy for the disconnect that's occurring here, or?
Sorry, my partner thought I was staring, so she thought the call was over.
No worries.
What was I saying? Yeah, you're talking about this analogy, whether it's similar to, a pure mathematician and an engineer.
In the sense that one is really
I guess
yes.
Yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even need to go as far as a pure mathematician and an engineer. We can say pure mathematician and a physicist. To be perfectly honest,
okay,
given a decent amount of time, a pure mathematician could understand what I do relatively easily. I think the opposite is absolutely not true. The level people in pure mathematics are working at is something that, for the kind of person I am and the way I think, just doesn't work for me. It doesn't click. So in a sense, there's a completely one-directional disconnect there. Okay, a pure mathematician might not give a damn about what I do, but I'm pretty sure they could do it if they wanted to. And
by the way, what you're saying is also true intra-field, within the field, because one pure mathematician working on topology versus another one working on, they have the same issues as a function. As a function of the field being 2,000 years old, from the very start to now, and it picking up exponentially past 1920, 1950, what have you.
I guess the reason I'd say, though, it's not quite the same as the difference between a social psychologist or a marketing person and a complexity scientist is partially because, and I think this comes at a field level arrogance. That's a weird term, but as an academic, the whole arrogance of the academic discipline, I think it's often hard for many complexity scientists to appreciate why anyone would work in the way that psychologists work at all.
Well, with the whole replication
and lots of people, I think,
issue,
think it's complete pseudoscience. So I think the difference there is bigger than between a pure mathematician and a physicist, or a pure mathematician and an engineer, because it's actually even a completely different mode of thinking, not just it's outside the mathematical realm usually. So it's a good question, but I think it's hard.
Those critiques of psychology you hear quite a lot, and on the one hand, I completely understand where it's coming from. You saw the whole replication issue where half of the papers didn't replicate. Obviously there's the publish or perish situation that's going on. So
that's true in physics and maths, and that's true in all of that.
Yes, true. And then one of the most important obstacles essentially that people in psychology have is if you look at, for example, classical mechanics, one of the reasons why people were able to make these relatively simple laws that describe seemingly complex behavior is not just because people are so incredibly smart. It's not just because that a physicist is an order of magnitude smarter than a psychologist. It's because for some reason nature has decided that it's possible to capture this seemingly complex behavior in a simple equation in a way that's just not true for human beings. So you run into these issues where the field itself is just so complicated, because if there were a simple law that would describe a certain subset of human behavior, you'd have already found it, because there are some physicists and some mathematicians who went to psychology. So even if, you know, the assumption were true that all psychologists were idiots, which probably isn't true, even still, one of those mathematicians should have discovered that principle, where it's like, hey, there's a very simple law, which is, you know, akin to you know, Newton's law of gravity, for example, which describes this particular set of human behavior. And also it becomes very tricky to keep important confounding variables out of the pictures and other variables constant in a way which is easier at certain mathematical things or physics. So certainly,
Well,
that's true for mathematics,
I guess
by the way.
I would disagree
Replicating
with you
an
a little
experiment.
bit, because
Okay,
that
sure.
is actually happening. That is happening, and there has been some success in it. And I think that is, to be honest, the whole field of computational social science is built around that. And to say there are no laws of, you know, human behavior, that's, I think, becoming increasingly, you know, wrong as a statement. I mean, I don't know if you know the Foundation novels, but there's this thing in the Foundation novels that you can predict humans en masse, the behavior of humans as a group, like over a long period of time and over billions of years, but you can't predict the individual. And now, you know, we're not living in Foundation. It's not as extreme like that, but there's a lot of work being done on understanding, you know, patterns of human behavior on the aggregate level. So for instance, there's really interesting stuff about how humans move and the kind of journeys they take. And you find very robust patterns in, you know, all sorts of cities all over the world, big cities, small cities, you know, English speaking cities, non-English speaking cities, about, you know, how long people will move for, the distance people will move for, how often they will take journeys longer than specific durations. And the patterns are actually incredibly robust. And you could go as far as to say in some cases that, you know, there's kind of a law that governs, you know, human mobility, for instance.
Or maybe like a guiding principle, which is like true enough or accurate enough. Yes.
But I mean, the people working on that, they usually aren't, you know, from a pure psychology background. That is approaching the problem with a mathematical framework. That is, you know, they are complexity scientists, physicists, mathematicians generally.
I see. Yeah. So it's similar. By the way, the same thing is happening in biology, but similar to like the branching. You know, it used to be like physics and philosophy were more hand in hand, and you know, eventually like they separated because physics went on, continued to march down the street of knowledge, essentially. That's interesting. I got one more thing that I'm curious about. So obviously you're working a lot on mathematics for the complexity things that you're involved with. Is it, maybe it's not possible, but is it possible to give like a sort of lay people breakdown in terms of like, how do you actually do that? How do you analyze complex systems in a way that's, you know, more rigorous and that doesn't allow for like pseudoscience or decreases the probability of pseudoscience?
I mean, I guess in short, I would say that's too big a question to answer easily. You know, I guess fundamentally, in my view, it comes down to, you know, always approaching problems, you know, with a degree of skepticism and with a, you know, certain level of, you know, statistical knowledge. And I think one of the big insights from complexity, which I think is, you know, helpful in general to think about, is that the behaviors that might emerge from lots of microscopic or lower level interactions, they may not always be well understood by reducing your problem. And as soon as you appreciate that reductionism only works in very limited domains and certainly doesn't work, you know, in any of the, you know, human contexts in the real world, which are, you know, where humans are constantly interacting in complex and unpredictable ways. If you approach a problem with that, you know, foundation, then I think you will have a better chance of staying on a, you know, productive road. That said, is there, you know, a robust framework for, you know, avoiding the traps of the past, for instance, like with the replication crisis? I think that's a whole cultural question, to be honest. I think the whole foundations of academia are built to be unreliable at the moment.
Wow.
Because the incentives are completely in the wrong place. And the way the whole system works is, you know, perverse in a way. So
yeah, it is kind of worrying.
And by the way, I'm not arrogant enough to think I can fix it or anyone else can fix it so easily.
We're counting on you, Max. The world is counting on you.
I think lots of people have these like nice ideas. Oh, if we change this one thing, you know, everything would be better. It's like, I don't believe you at all. No chance. I think it's far more.
Maybe that's because, yeah, maybe, yeah, exactly. Maybe it's because, you know, of your background in complex systems that you're.
I mean, I give you an example, for instance. People are constantly in the last 2-3 years, if not longer, constantly you hear social media platforms should do more to regulate their platforms. Constantly you hear this. And you hear it heavily from people who have no
disagree with the stuff,
for instance, dealing with, you know, social systems or network structures. Now, I'm not actually against necessarily regulating social media platforms more. I think there's, you know, a discussion to be had about that. But
you have to be very
people
careful.
Think it's easy when people, you know, when the media says, oh, they should regulate Facebook or Twitter more, they say it as if there's these completely obvious things you could implement, which would, you know, completely change how social media works. And I think that's an utterly naive way of thinking about the problem. I think part of the reason these platforms find it so difficult is self-interest and financial, but just as big a part is because these measures people think are easy are not easy.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. That there's another caveat, which is that these algorithms, by virtue of these companies being public, and, you know, you have venture capital which need to be returned to the shareholders, is that these algorithms tend to be optimized for engagement, and stuff that tends to work in terms of engagements are these extreme propositions. So when someone like you comes in with a very well-reasoned, well thought out, nuanced take on an issue, it's much harder for that to go viral than something that's very easy to grasp. And there's some psychological research on, you know, the cognitive difficulty of a certain proposition and how in relation to, you know, its ability to go viral and spread. So when you have someone who's, by the way, it's one of the reasons why there are so much more nonsense on the internet than, you know, scientific lectures, etc. The nuanced stuff, the harder stuff, you're asking for more cognitive involvement. It's the message itself is not as appetizing, you know, it's not as appealing versus like these very, this is how it is. There's some research on certainty, you know, how that certainty is more important than the truth value of a proposition, in terms of it actually having a convincing component to it. So I think all of these things play a certain role, because it's quite rare it happens, but it's quite rare to see like threads which are highly nuanced and which stress like all of these different issues that they spread. And it does happen if you can find a way to package it in a way where it's appealing. But the opposite tends to have an advantage, where it's like you know, this is how it is, and it's super easy, and these guys are idiots if they only did this. Because if people already agree with it, you have the confirmation bias, stuff like that, you know, that rears its head, where it's like, I already agree with this, so let me click like and let me share it, and now it, you know, your audience sees it.
Yeah. You don't need to tell me that nuance is not popular. It takes too damn long to nuance. The most popular tweet I ever sent was me bitching about how PhDs weren't paid enough, and how which I still agree with, but they refuse to give us any more money, but are happy to send literally thousands of pounds to publishers for work that's literally just me, you know, working by myself for a few months. My work is valued at £8 an hour, but the privilege of publishing it in a, you know, nice reputable journal is worth, you know, £2,500. I sent some pissy message about that and did very well. And every time I try to be nuanced, it like dies. So, you know, I know, man, I know.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, or all the research, if you can't access it via university, you know, that it's cost prohibitive to access databases. Same thing. Let me ask you one more question, and this is going to be like another tricky question, so I don't know, you know, take it wherever you want to take it. But if it's possible, can you give like can you kind of like break down your thinking or your approach that you use when it comes to, like, you know, analyzing complex systems? Is there some process, some structure, like, you know, we start with the variables, or when does the mathematics come in exactly? Or is it, or maybe it's just, you know, you have so much expertise and it's on a case-by-case basis?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess I'll start by saying that, you know, generally, people working in complex systems and in academia, generally, they're doing it because they are, you know, curious about the problem. And I think whether you're a complexity scientist or any other kind of scientist, the reason you're doing what you're doing is fundamentally, you know, a question of curiosity. So when you ask, you know, how do I approach a problem, it's like, it's usually because there's something I don't understand, and there's some promising way that I might understand that better. You know, there's these, you know, the big questions of life that are, you know, nice to talk about philosophically, but you can't see any route of making progress. You know, what's the meaning of life? Nice question, but never met anyone who has a good idea of how actually, you know, to investigate the question. I guess the point is that
feels a little bit like
curious about the problem precisely because you see that there might actually be some hope for being able to answer it. And then you basically, it's usually, you have some big problem, and the first thing you do is turn that into a little problem. You just try to understand one tiny little thing and treat it like a little toy. So if you talk about something like human interactions, throw away all nuance about, you know, what we're interacting about, throw away, you know, all concepts of, you know, likes, shares, retweets, whatever. Just completely abstract the problem first. It's like, what's the fundamental essence of this? Well, the fundamental essence is that you have two or more people and information flows from one of them to the other one. So you have 2 points in space and you draw an arrow between them. And then you might have a third person and you draw another arrow from the second person to the third person. And then you can treat that as a toy. You can treat it like, you know, kids line up their dominoes, and there's you know, a single chain of dominoes, and you knock the one and you watch the whole chain go. But with something like a network, you can basically treat that as a chain of dominoes, except the dominoes split. So you can knock over one domino and then you can watch how the like cascade flows. And that's basically a toy, and that's what you do. And once you understand some toy game, then you can think about, okay, well, how is this toy game different to the problem I actually care about? And that's, you know, whether you care more about the toy version or the second question is part of what makes you, you know, a theorist in complex systems, or, you know, an applied person, because you're using these ideas at some level of abstraction. But yeah, the question of when does the maths get involved? I guess
from the start,
the maths gets involved when, you know, the toys get too complicated for you to just, you know, write +1, -1, yeah, watch the dominoes fall. The maths is just a systematic way of looking at a toy example.
And then depending on whether you're more in the applied direction or the theoretical, that determines like the feedback loop with reality, the testing and seeing if your models are correct. Yeah.
I guess the point is a theorist couldn't care less often whether their models are correct. The theorist just likes the toy. You know, I've written some like theoretical.
We have some of those people in. We have some of those people in marketing science. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying I've written, you know, theoretical network papers, and to be honest, I don't care whether that's how it actually happens in the real world. Of course, in the introduction, I have to say it does matter. Why? Because the journal always asks, is this actually relevant? And the answer is no. But if I say no, they won't publish it. So I have to say yes.
Yes, highly relevant.
Highly relevant, exactly. But you know, the point is you play enough of these games and then you start seeing patterns and they're like, oh, you know, maybe this is interesting. And maybe it is actually relevant to, you know, some real examples.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think.
And there are also quite a bit of examples where, you know, the direction of knowledge, so to speak, travels the other way. So it starts with the toy models, and it starts with this thing where you're sure that it has no practical application. I believe Hardy, I believe he wrote a paper or something where he made a remark, which was something, you know, kind of like being a little bit condescending towards applied mathematics, and where he was talking about his area of pure mathematics and how it would never have, you know, a function in the real world, and that's part of what its beauty. And then it turns out, like, you know, a few hundred years later, suddenly it's being used with computers and security and whatnot. So sometimes, even though it's not immediately obvious, you know, whether or not this will be used. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's how most theorists justify their existence. The funder says, why are you relevant? And the theorist says, I have no idea, but I might be in the future, and that's why you should give me lots of money. That's, you know, that's the whole game.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I don't want to keep you any longer. This has been an absolute joy for me. It's been a blast to hear some of the stuff that
it's been fun. Thanks, man.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll talk soon. I'll hit you up on Twitter, and if I include something, some, you know, things that you want to share, or by the way, maybe there's something that you want to share right now, a website or anything, or.
No, I'm good. I you know, had we done this in a week's time, I would have shared some of our stuff on climate misinformation. We've got where I shouldn't say misinformation, climate information. We've got a nice dashboard coming out where you can see like the discussion. You can basically visualize the discussion on Twitter around COP26, which is starting this Sunday. And, you know, we've approached it from a point of, you know, we make no moral judgment. You can just look at the structure of the interactions. But actually, if you look at the structure of the interactions, you see some interesting clustering between, you know, certain groups who have one view and certain groups who have an opposing view. And, you know, it's a fun tool, but it's not live yet. It'll be live in like 3 days or so. So
Let me sneak in like one small quick little question really quickly. By the way, the link I'll when I upload it on YouTube, I'll make sure to put it in the description for the people who want to check it out. Yeah, you said we're just going to give people the information and they can draw their own conclusions. In your best guess, and I won't hold you to it, do you feel like that's how scientists should act, just present the facts and then let lay people interpret it for themselves, or do you feel like there's a part of the obligation is?
No, I think generally scientists should do make a conscious effort to, you know, distill their ideas for their audience. However, the topic I'm talking about is climate misinformation, you know. And fundamentally that is, you know, one of the great shouting matches of the last 100 years, 50 years, is one group of people shouting at the other group of people, you're ruining the planet, and the other group of people shouting back, yeah, but you want to crash the economy. And generally, in those scenarios, I don't like, you know, shouting at one side or the other. And in those cases, you know, you need to be a little bit more careful about how you present your results. But in general, I think people should, you know, scientists should make a like conscious effort to, you know, be clear with their messaging and try to explain why people should care. Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been awesome, man. Thanks again, man. And we'll stay in touch. We'll talk soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let me know how it goes, and I look forward to seeing it.
All right. Take care, buddy.
Bye. See you later. Have a good one.